Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Danny Harris. I'm the Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives, and just so glad that you could be with us today for a conversation about BikeMatch. And I think first and foremost, I want to share my hope that you're staying safe and sort of trying to make sense and maybe as possible making the best of this moment for your work and your advocacy. We obviously know this is a very difficult time for our world, and we really are grateful that you could take an hour out of your day and spend it with us to talk about something positive that we have all helped to build together. And we're so fortunate to have a really stellar panel today. And before I make introductions, it gives me such incredible pleasure to introduce my colleague, Jay Oberman, who I can say without pause is really the godfather of BikeMatch. And so without further ado, let me just introduce Jay and ask him to share a bit about himself, where the idea came from, and if he can also maybe share a word or two about what actually happened with the first BikeMatch. Jay, let me turn it to you, please.
Sure. Hey. Yeah, so I'm Jay. I've been at Transportation Alternatives around 5 years. I'm the art director there. And yeah, I had a bike that I wasn't using, and I just thought somebody needs this bike right now. So I posted it online, and really quickly, somebody that I knew had a friend who needed it, and they came and got it. Basically we like timed it perfectly so that I could put it outside right as they were approaching, so that we didn't have to like make any kind of contact. And then afterwards, I knocked on the window and we waved and blew kisses. And that sounds made up, but that's really what happened. And yeah, they're using it now for mutual aid stuff. They're doing food and plant justice stuff around the neighborhood, and they're providing like vegetables to our neighbors and seeds for vegetables, which is super cool. So yeah.
Thank you, Jay. So since those humble beginnings, we're incredibly fortunate that now BikeMatch is in 29 cities around the world, from DC and LA, as we'll hear more about today, to Vancouver and Tel Aviv, and growing. We're really excited to see that it's in communities big and small, from Macon and Tarrytown to San Francisco and DC and Cleveland and Indianapolis. So it's really exciting to see more people step up. And in New York, we're incredibly fortunate. We've just crossed the threshold of 200 bikes. I think our total number of participants now is actually approaching 1,000. And I think, as we'll talk about today, and I imagine many of you are experiencing, there's a bike boom and there's a rush on bikes. And we'll hear a bit about that from Specialized as well on the call. But anybody here, just simply take a walk into any bike store, or I guess stand outside of a bike store. They look like clubs now. They all have these velvet ropes outside as you have to wait to get in, but there's obviously a long back order to get there. So I really am excited to hear from our panelists today, and also to hear from all of you in our first webinar that TA is kicking off. So without further ado, let me introduce Rachel Maisler is the founder and CEO of Wonk Policy and Communications in DC. She was our first official spinoff in Washington, DC, where I'm also fortunate to have lived for 8 years. So happy to see that a city that I also hold very dear was on the forefront of that. Ian Kenny leads global marketing for Specialized Bikes and is based in San Francisco. As we were stepping up and escalating this program, we were so incredibly fortunate that Specialized did step up. You hear I have some unhappy people in the background. I have 2 little kids, so you'll just have to, at least for situational context. Specialized quickly stepped up, and they put forward a really ambitious plan, including a few hundred bikes that they started to give out across the country for essential workers. And then Kevin Shin is the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships for LA County Bike Coalition, and he's been running BikeMatch in LA County in partnership with Bike Shop California, Masa of Echo Park, and Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. So with that, I'm really excited to sort of get things going. And maybe I can just start with you, Rachel and Kevin. Can you share a little bit about, what the situations are like on the ground in DC and LA, and why both of you thought BikeMatch and especially getting bikes to essential workers might be helpful for your communities amid coronavirus?
So in DC, about I think it's 40% of people don't have cars. And, a lot of people rely on public transportation to get to and from work at all hours. And way back in March, feels like an eternity ago, when the public transportation, when the metro started cutting back on service, when the buses started cutting back on service, and then they started cutting back on service more, there was less ways for people to get to work. Not everybody can afford a ride hailing service. Not everybody wanted to get in the backseat of a car that's been shared by many different people. So bikes were a logical way to get people to and from work at all hours. And having seen what you all at Transalt did in New York, we were like, why don't we do this in DC? So I'll stop there and let Kevin talk about LA.
Yeah, so funny enough, the reason I came across this in the first place actually was because of you, Rachel. So I also am a former DC resident, lived in DC proper for 3 years, but the DC area as a whole for 8. And I'm still a regular reader of Prince of Petworth, and they highlighted the bike match on POP. And so I was looking at that one morning and I was thinking to myself, wait, why aren't we doing this in LA? And immediately took it upon myself. I talked it over with Eli, our executive director, and figured, why aren't we doing this? Because this is the best possible way to grow bike culture in a city that is known for being all about car culture. And at a moment when nobody is out commuting, when people aren't driving as much as they used to, we still saw, most other cities saw their public transit use trail off into single-digit percentages. LA, average ridership on most typical days is about 1.2 to 1.3 million. We're still seeing about 450,000 to 500,000 trips a day. So there's still a significant number of people who need to find other modes of transportation to get to their essential jobs, to get to the work that is keeping our economy going. And we felt this was a way that we, as the LA County Bike Coalition, could contribute to that. And so we started looking at opportunities, and we were fortunate enough also, in addition to the people stepping up and donating their bikes, we were actually fortunate enough to have one of our local bike companies. They had excess inventory sitting around, that's old inventory that they weren't going to be able to sell, and so they donated it all to us. And we're going to actually be working to work with our local shops and co-ops to assemble all of those bikes, looking for funding to help pay them to do that, and then also turning those bikes around and giving them out to essential workers and in low income and highly impacted communities.
Ian, can I turn to you, and can you just give us a window? We're hearing a lot of, at least what we're calling a bike boom, and seeing more people on bikes. Can you just give us a window from Specialized of what the bike boom looks like from your side?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And thanks for including me in today's conversation. Hi, everybody. Like you, I've got a small human here, so you may or may not hear him. Yeah, I can give you a kind of our view on this. So we are a global company. And I think what's been really interesting is, as we've all started to work more closely together remotely, we're having, daily, weekly calls with global counterparts, be it in Italy and South Africa, really all over the world. And one thing has remained consistent, which is that as people are experiencing this kind of shared moment together, the bike has become a sort of foundational and elemental support mechanism for communities across the globe, whether it's for physical and mental health, whether it's for essential transportation, whether it's for an escape, right? People are really turning to the bike in this moment. And we've really seen that happening consistently in all of the markets where we operate. Now, that being said, I think that was in some ways to be expected in places where, you know, riding a bike was more culturally normative. But what we're also seeing is that in markets where people maybe hadn't thought about riding, or where riding was, you know, more of an enthusiast activity, we're seeing a lot of new riders coming into the brand and into riding again, maybe for the first time since they were a kid, or maybe for the first time, period. And so it's been really, I would say, heartening on one level, and on another level, it's presented a real, you know, challenge and opportunity for the industry to try to keep up with the demand that we're seeing. Those lines around the shops are real, and therefore inventory becomes a real, you know, question mark and concern. And then, you know, I think the other point is, how do we continue to engage new riders and support people who have been riding and who have been closest to trying to, you know, make cycling and active transportation a much more regular occurrence in many places. So that's kind of, from our side at least, what we're seeing, and, you know, happy to dig into that in any way that you'd like.
Great. I'd love to. Let me turn to you, Rachel. Can you talk a little bit? You know, a lot of the things that we're hearing about, but also align with what Ian has said, is that there's obviously a growing demand and a shortage of supply. So can you talk a little bit about what your numbers are looking like now, and how you're working to address that gap if you are experiencing it in DC?
Yeah, so I'm super excited to report we have about 100 matches in DC, which is pretty incredible. And about 15 of those matches have been through a partnership with Bikes for the World, which is an organization that normally they collect donated bikes and then normally ship them to developing countries like El Salvador. But with international shipping essentially on hold, they have bikes that need people to ride them. And pretty quickly, pretty early on, they reached out to us and were like, hey, we've got bikes. They're just sitting here collecting dust. Can we get them into the hands of essential workers? And we're like, yeah, absolutely. So they've been working with us to get more and more bikes into people's hands, which is really cool, because, you know, getting people to and from work via bicycle is a form of transportation, and that falls within their mission. And right now, without being able to ship around the world, they're able to serve their local community. So their board quickly got on board to be able to broaden our reach, which is really incredible.
Kevin, can you talk a little bit about, as you're getting more people into your network, of how you're also sharing with them either the norms or the challenges of biking around LA?
Sure. So we've been very fortunate that, because the Bike Coalition here represents 13 different chapters, as well as a series of what we call bike ambassadors throughout the city of LA. We've been able to kind of build a network of people out there who are able to kind of carry on the message and help make sure that people, when they do come into biking, are feeling comfortable with the idea. What we've been able to do with the people who are getting the bikes is, right now we're focused on just sort of making sure that those people are safe. We've been producing a series of simple videos. Actually, our executive director and his 11-year-old son are featured in those videos, basically doing basic things like the ABC Quick Check, you know, doing hand signals, making sure that people have some of the general basics of how to get out and start riding, especially in some of the environments that are a little bit more comfortable right now, because, you know, all cities are looking at reducing the amount of traffic in neighborhood streets. But in addition to that, LACBC has also had a history of providing, through our local MTA, a series of classes on bike education, and everything from your Bicycling 101, which is more sort of a super basic introduction to bicycling, all the way up through, we had classes that were leading people on sort of semi-extended road rides, as well as providing opportunities for people to go out and explore their communities together. So with the classes kind of, you know, on hold because of, with the in-person classes on hold because of the current health crisis, we've really looked towards using online means and encouraging people to reach out and use the resources that we've built up over the course of our 20-year history, putting as much of that stuff online as possible, restarting our YouTube channel, focusing on ways to get the information out there as best as possible in a way, in different mediums that hopefully are engaging people.
Nice. Ian, you'd mentioned that because you obviously you work globally and your BikeMatch program also targeted communities across the country. Can you maybe share a little bit about what you're hearing or seeing from maybe some of the smaller communities, especially some of the ones that you may have mentioned before who are getting bikes for essential workers?
Yeah, can you hear me okay? I think things just froze up for a second. Great. Yeah, if I'm understanding the question correctly, so we basically we ran a program shortly after shelter in place, orders across a number of different states were really kind of being implemented. And the question we were kind of asking ourselves was, we want to do something to help in this situation, but we also wanted to solve a real problem. And it turns out that bikes are great at solving real problems. And so we, kind of marshaled some resources internally and put out a call to action within our community to help surface the people within communities across the country who were in need of essential transportation. And the response was really, frankly, overwhelming. I would say within the period of 2 to 3 days, we had over 30,000 applications that we received to the portal that we created. We were also directing and providing, links to the match programs that many of the people on this call helped to form. And so thank you for that work. And hopefully some of that that visibility helped with your programs as well. But really kind of what we're learning now as the bikes are actually making their way to people and have been, is that the variety in terms of who they're going to is just really kind of astonishing. Everything from very rural communities where people are the only person working in a bank as a teller to serve a Native American reservation and are commuting via dirt road and rely on, a really quality bike to get there, to, people in our community here in the Bay Area who, are no longer able to rely on BART or Muni or other transit. So, I think for us, it's been a very good exercise. I would say just very plainly, the industry has continued to sort of grapple with how do we engage best with riders, but also community organizers. And this feels like a really good building block for us to kind of carry forward in terms of what a partnership in that regard can look like.
Thanks. Rachel and Kevin, one of the things that we hear a lot from other communities is just, some of the basics, how do I start a BikeMatch program in my community? And I know that obviously both of you represent, obviously a very passionate individual and also an organization. Can you talk a bit from both of your perspectives, just maybe give a few pointers for people who may be joining us who want to start a BikeMatch program in their city?
Sure. So in DC, we waited a minute and no other organization started a bike match. So I happened to have an LLC and I called a lawyer. I called a friend who's really good at logistics. Shout out to Rudy, my co-partner on this. But Rudy handled the back end. I handled the front end, and also was like, call a lawyer, make sure we've got liability covered. So I called the guy that's taking care of my bike crash cases. And he wrote us an ironclad waiver, and we set up a website. We set up a Google form based on your Google form. I think this is before your Medium article came out. Rudy figured out the back end of the logistics of how to set up the form and who needs a bike and who wants a bike and who has bikes and sizes and types of bikes and all that fun stuff. And then the next piece was getting the word out. So I have a transportation media list, wrote ourselves a little press release and sent it to this small group of reporters that have consistently done a good job of covering bike issues in DC. And then also anytime you need to get the word out in DC, Kevin mentioned earlier, the Prince of Petworth has thousands of readers all over the country. So I guess that got the word out to LA. But I think some of our biggest, the biggest publicity we got was from two of the local TV stations, our CBS affiliate and our NBC affiliate. And that kind of expanded our reach, not just to the people who needed bikes, but the non-traditional people, you know, like Rudy and I have our social media networks, and Rudy's in Potomac Peddlers, and I'm on the Bike Advisory Council here. So we have our traditional bike advocacy networks and Safe Streets networks. But being on network TV got us to the non-traditional folks who might have had that bike sitting in their garage. And I also got 2 bikes by just sending an email to my synagogue listserv to say, hey, we need bikes. If you've got one laying around, let us know.
And so, Kevin, before I turn to you, Rachel, so where did your first bike come from?
I don't even remember where our first bike come from. It was probably somebody that knew me or Rudy and saw one of our tweets about it. I do regret not setting up a specific social media account. We've been doing all the social media under our personal account, so that makes branding a little tough. But it was probably somebody in one of our networks. At this point, we've matched so many bikes, I don't even remember.
That's great.
Rudy, text me if you remember.
So to Rachel's point, you know, it really was a very grassroots effort, and here we started doing the bike match on a county level, but even before that, we started having conversations with some of our local advocates and partners, and some of them were already thinking about, like, how do I do it for a very specific, very targeted audience? So one of our partners, Walk-In Rollers, they only wanted to focus on kids. So they were only pulling the kids' bikes and only doing it for kids in the local community in and around LA proper. And so it really became an effort to just sort of like, how do we take that mindset, how do we take that desire to help the community and sort of grow it and expand it out to the much broader audience of the entire region of LA. And for us, you know, the real challenge is LA is such a sprawling region. You know, we're about, I want to say it's 75 miles east to west and about 55 to 60 miles north to south at a bare minimum in terms of just the county of Los Angeles. So we have so much territory to cover. Our biggest problem is finding enough bikes that are close enough to other people so that we're not sending people, you know, 150 miles round trip to go and pick up a bike. But we've seen a lot of interest from our local community. We're fortunate to have 13 chapters that represent different cities and municipalities within the county of Los Angeles. And so we've been able to promote through them. We put it out on our social media, and we are, you know, as soon as we kind of get the funding issue dealt with for all of those bikes that we're trying to build, we're going to do a big press launch around that effort as well. And so the goal really is to make sure that our communities are well taken care of. And we're also looking at it from a slightly different perspective in terms of our distribution. We're not only focusing on doing the one-to-one handoffs, we are actually reaching out to some of our partners in those lower income and previously disinvested communities. We're looking to reach out to them, to partner with them, because they have the on-the-ground network in those communities to identify the people who are of the greatest need. And so we're actually going to take a big portion of the donated bikes that we build up. We're actually going to be donating those to those organizations and handing them out through the organizations, because we recognize that we don't want to be kind of helicoptering in and claiming that we're doing this, you know, as a means of just, you know, just showing that we're doing good work. We want to do it in a collaborative way with all of the local community organizations that have been spending, you know, years and years building those relationships, and we feel like they have the relationships deep within those communities, especially those communities that have a lot of essential workers coming from them. We want to make sure that those communities are being served by the local CBOs that have been building those relationships with them.
Right. So just the last question here, and then we have a bunch of questions that have come through, but all of us are representing various interests, advocacy groups who have a shared desire to make biking safer and to extend bike networks across our cities and really across the country. So Ian, let me start with you. As you're seeing both in terms of what you've been able to achieve with BikeMatch, but also more broadly, this bike boom, can you give us a window of how you're thinking about capturing this moment for advocacy, especially on better bike infrastructure in cities?
Yeah, I think where it starts with us, truthfully, is more meaningfully engaging in the conversation. And I would say plainly, much of the industry has relied on partnerships and funding alliances to do that work, which I think will remain an important part of the strategy for many in the industry. But a much more direct relationship and conversation, I would say, is now taking place, especially as cities, local governments, federal governments are really starting to have much more meaningful conversations around the role that the bicycle is going to play in a post-pandemic world. We have really been engaged in a much more direct manner in those conversations because people are looking for industry input. We won't have all the answers, certainly. And so I think part of the way that we're thinking about that is to really make sure that we can use the platform that we have as a bigger brand, as an industry leader, to raise up the voices and the conversations that have been happening for many years around this subject, and get the right folks in conversation so that meaningful change can happen. That's really how we're thinking about it. But there's certainly a lot more work that we can be doing and plan to be doing beyond just sort of capitalizing on a bike boom. I think we can acknowledge as riders, which we all are, we want to see lasting change here as much as anybody else does.
Thanks. And Rachel and Kevin, let me turn to you both. I think one of the things that we all have in common is we have mayors who believe that we are so unique and wonderful that we're not able to learn from other cities. So it sounds like hearing from your mayors that we're sort of watching the reruns that have been playing out from city to city, especially as it relates to open streets. So Rachel, can I turn to you first? I know that there is discussion about some open streets and some bike infrastructure. What's happening on the ground in DC? And then I turn to you, Kevin.
That's a tough question to answer. I like to try and stay positive, but I don't have a lot of positive things to say about what's happened on the ground in DC as far as adding temporary infrastructure during this time and looking forward. One of our council members said at a hearing about a year ago, our Department of Transportation here studies and studies and studies until the study becomes obsolete and then studies again. And that's what we're hearing from the mayor. She wants to study and look at what we can possibly do. And, we will sit here and wait and advocate. We have a Department of Transformation, though, that has tried to demonstrate what can be done and how we can reimagine our streets. So I will leave it at that. But also the National Park Service did shut down some streets in the national parks we have here in DC to allow space for people to move around, which has been incredible if you have access to those areas.
And in LA, again, the size and expanse of what LA covers is a real problem. So it becomes really difficult to manage that process, and with limited resources, it becomes incredibly challenging to figure out where to put those. So the way the city has approached rolling this out right now is that they're encouraging individual community groups as well as neighborhood councils to actually apply for the process, and they're working to roll it out over the course of an extended period of time. And in terms of figuring out how we sort of transition all of these, open streets opportunities into something that's a little bit more long term. We actually have a companion program that we've started with one of the groups that came out of our bike ambassadors in the city of LA, and are actually doing a program called Bikes Mean Business. And it's an opportunity for cyclists to actually support. We already have certain identified corridors in parts of the city and actually throughout the entire county. And we know that those corridors are either one, facing opposition from challenging locations or local businesses, but also local residents who don't necessarily feel like the presence of bike lanes is wanted in their communities, despite what studies or what public sentiment may actually be. So what we're doing is we're actually working with local groups to begin to identify small businesses, local businesses to support. And we're doing about every other week, we're doing a campaign, outreach campaign to kind of market that organization, encourage all of the local cyclists to go and support that organization. And anybody who, if it's a restaurant and somebody doesn't want to buy a meal from the restaurant, we've actually set up a donation form where they can actually make a contribution, and we'll donate those funds to the restaurant. We've done a few weeks of this now. The response has been absolutely fantastic, and the turnaround, the feedback from the community has been, oh, we didn't realize that like the cycling community was out to really, was this supportive of our local businesses, and it's really started to change people's perspectives on that. So this is an opportunity to leverage that into a way to kind of grow the culture and expand the culture beyond sort of your traditional cyclists. We're looking for ways to really grow this amongst kind of people who are drivers every day, but we want them to understand and see like the value that the cycling community really brings to the community especially in this moment and during this crisis. Probably one of the great stories to come out of this so far is Masa of Echo Park, one of the restaurants that we highlighted, did so well that day that they actually took the funds that were donated to them and turned it around and donated it back to the BikeMatch program. So they're sponsoring our BikeMatch with those donated funds. And so it's this type of, open streets are great, but unless we can also build upon the culture, and unless we can start to get those communities to understand that cyclists are all around, that we are, contributors to this community in a major way, until we can do that, we're not really going to be able to get the changes that we want. And we also want to make sure that as we're looking at how we're going to come out of and grow out of this current health crisis, that we're able to figure out ways to kind of really focus the attention on not going back to the status quo, not going back to that old normal of everybody getting in their cars.
Yeah, something Kevin just said sort of reminded me of, another one of our kind of efforts in this moment is, we dialogue with literally millions of cyclists around the world on a daily basis. And a big part of what we are seeking to do coming out of this experience is, to that point, is really make cycling and riding more a part of the culture in places that it hasn't been. And part of that is our ability to communicate very directly with people in communities in far-flung places, and then working with organizations like Transall, or frankly, many others. And increasingly, we want to be able to kind of rally our community around the causes that are going to help create the groundswell of support that is needed for lasting change. Because, I think we've all experienced studies on studies on studies and research on research on research without that being backed by action. And so part of what we will seek to do is really engage our community in a much more meaningful way going forward.
Great, thanks. So now I'd like to open it up to questions. There are a few of them that have already come through, others over social, but if you do have a question, you can add it into the Q&A portion underneath. So let me start with Rachel and Kevin. Someone is asking about the condition of bikes. Do you have, are you asking that bikes all come in good working order? If bikes that you do get are not in good shape, do you have a partnership with a bike shop? Or can you talk a little bit about how you're handling that maintenance?
I guess I'm off mute. So we require that all bikes are in rideable condition to be able to be donated. A couple people have reached out to us and said, hey, if you've got some bikes, like I've got a shop in my house that I can tune stuff up or do minor work. So we've tried to work with some people. We had a couple bikes that came in to get those fixed up so we could get them donated. We also have, I know one donor brought his bike into a local bike shop and got it fully tuned up, so it was in good working order when he handed it off. Of course, getting into a local bike shop for a tune-up is a challenge unto itself these days, just given the bike boom. And I think another bike we have at a local bike co-op called Gearing Up Bikes, which teaches kids in the community how to become bike mechanics. They've had limited service. I think they're mostly full service at the moment, but because of the health emergency. But I think we have one bike that's getting tuned up there. But if folks don't have working bikes, then we tell them, you have to figure it out. And once the bike's working, we're happy to have you. Rudy just texted me, Gearing Up is back to full service now.
Here in LA, what we've asked for is that if people, if people are able to provide the bikes in relatively good working condition, that we would be able to match those right away. And for others, because we have been fortunate enough to have these good relationships with our bike co-ops and the bike shops, folks like Bike Shop California, that's housing a lot of our donated bikes at the moment. Folks from the Bike Kitchen and Ride On Bike Co-op and Bike Wave have all offered to provide service if we come across bikes that require it. We have partnerships with other organizations, Walk and Rollers that I mentioned earlier. They actually are taking in some of those bikes and doing repairs, basic repairs to them. Simple things like getting chains lubed, making sure that brakes are working properly, simple things like that, just to get the bikes to a rideable condition. So as much as possible, we ask for rideable bikes, but if it's not rideable, we do have a way of making sure that people can get that to a shop or a mechanic who's able to help fix that. And as an additional kind of layer to it, if somebody isn't able to bring the bike to a shop, we've had some conversations with mobile bike shop VeloFix, and they've offered that if we are able to gather a few folks together in the same location for a distribution, they would actually show up and do repairs on the spot to help make sure that people are able to get access to those bikes. So there's a couple of different approaches to it. And we've been super fortunate that our network has really stepped up to help us out in this regard.
Ian, have you put out, or are you familiar with sort of online tools that can help people with maintenance that are either connected to Specialized or others that maybe you use or lean on?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I was just on a call earlier today about that exact subject. So yeah, I mean, there are lots of, YouTube is the best resource for everybody these days, truth be told. There are great organizations doing great work in that space, but we've actually been talking more about, as a brand, how do we support new riders who are coming back into riding, whether it's on our bike or anybody else's, to be giving them kind of really simple, straightforward tips on maintenance, on repairs, on things that they can kind of bootstrap, the stuff that anybody who's ridden a bike for a long time just sort of learns over time. How do we shorten that learning curve? And so that's one of the things that we are excited to be working on as a brand. And that's a great example of something that we're just going to start kind of putting out into the world to join all of the other great content that's out there.
Great, thanks. So with that, I just make a kind of a quick plug. We put out a call on Twitter just asking people, what are the things that no one ever tells you about, but you learn while riding in New York City. And we compiled it as just sort of a list of 100 tips for new riders. So Nate, I'd ask if you wouldn't mind just putting that in the chat. But obviously, I think there's so many great resources from locals, and I think one of the things that we tell people as they're getting new to ride is just reach out and either ask somebody who's already riding, even if they're a stranger, or reach out to somebody who might be in your community who does ride to get some tips. We have another question here from an anonymous, but it asks whether in either of your markets are people either loading their bikes or is it all donation? I don't know. They also asked maybe if people are selling their bikes through BikeMatch.
We had a couple of people who thought that they were going to be able to just loan their bike, and because of the nature of COVID-19 and liability, all matches are final. We haven't had anybody who wanted to sell their bike through us, but I imagine we would turn them away as well and tell them to utilize other platforms.
And for us, we have had a couple of people inquire about the possibility of loaning, and again, to everyone's point, like the nature of COVID-19 doesn't really allow for that to happen in a good way. So for us, we've really focused on making sure that that they are true donations and that people understand that the exchange is permanent. And as far as selling bikes, we actually haven't even had a single inquiry about selling bikes. Everybody has been more than happy to just donate what they have sitting in their garage or sitting in their closet.
We did have one or two people ask for, sorry, my cat decided to jump up on my lap. Furry creatures for the win. But we had one person or two people ask if they could have a tax donation form. And because we're operating under an LLC, which we try and make abundantly clear, like we have a gmail.com email address and a .com website, we had to tell them no and just hope for the best on that front. I guess it's different in LA though.
We actually haven't had anyone ask for a donation letter. We probably will go back at the end of the crisis and send all of the donors a simple donation thank you letter that they can use with the IRS, as we are a 501c3. But we actually haven't had anybody ask, and everybody is really stepping up to do this out of a sense of generosity, and I think that's been really fantastic to see the community really want to reach out and help each other.
Ian, I see a question here that's asking if you could share any specifics with the growth of demand are you seeing people asking for different types of bikes or different types of accessories, or maybe can you give a window into what demand for specific bikes looks like now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the categories that we're seeing demand spike in, it's really across the board. I would say the biggest surges that we are seeing, though, is in kind of what we would consider bikes that are primarily focused around commuters, fitness riders, recreational riders. We're seeing kind of twofold, right? Huge boom in kids' bikes. A lot of parents at home with their kids looking for something to go do. And so a bike is a great way to do that. And then often what we're seeing is the whole family actually getting on the bike. And so we're seeing a lot of that. Definitely surges in enthusiast riders though as well in the mountain and road space. I think people looking for some form of escape where they can ride. But the lion's share of the growth that we are seeing is excitingly in sort of bikes being used for local transportation, fitness and recreation.
Okay. And Rachel and Kevin, a question came in about, when we are, as we're seeing in New York, a huge spike in demand, but the absence of supply, when we're not able to lean on, the generosity, or hopefully when we are able to lean on the generosity of Specialized and others, but when we are seeing a peak, I think for us right now, we have a gap of around 800 bikes that we're trying to fill. can you have you found any creative tools to try to get bikes at scale? I know, Rachel, you'd obviously mentioned working with another local organization that collects them, but any other ideas that you'd found for people about where you could potentially find some other bikes?
I mean, again, so the Bikes for the World thing, it was incredible when they reached out to us, and their impact has been huge. But the non-traditional listservs, the non-traditional community groups, like I said, my synagogue listserv, I was able to get some bikes. If there's other like parent group listservs, it might be harder now that people are rediscovering their bikes than it was earlier on. But whatever groups you're in where it's not the, as we say, like DC, the Bike DC echo chamber. So getting out of your local bike echo chamber and looking at the other groups. Is there a PTA or a PTO, like a parents group or whatever in your area? Is, other faith-based institutions? What other groups in your community? What other resources do you have in your community with people who might have bikes that are collecting dust? Is would be my advice.
For us, we've also looked at some kind of somewhat non-traditional options. We know that oftentimes at the end of school years, many college campuses end up with a huge supply of leftover bikes. And so oftentimes they're in a state of disrepair, which means that we would have to figure out a way to get them to, transport them to a shop for some basic maintenance in order to get them rideable. We've also had some conversations with local police departments who also end up with a huge stockpile of either impounded or stolen or otherwise bikes that they have on hand, that we've been able to kind of talk to them about the possibility of working with them to rehab some of those and put them back out into the community. Other options that we've looked at are really just kind of local agencies that are responsible for basically collecting bikes that end up being abandoned. We're looking at ways to partner with them to turn around those bikes. So it really has been about collaboration. And for us, because we have access to that network of bike co-ops and bike shops that we've been able to collaborate with, they're very much willing and ready to kind of jump in if we can find a steady funding stream for this. They actually see this as something that we would be able to not just carry on during the crisis, but also to actually have BikeMatch become a regular ongoing program throughout the course of any given year, because it's an opportunity to really take a lot of these abandoned bikes and put them back on the street, put them in the hands of people who are going to be using them. And again, it's really about making sure that bike culture becomes kind of a norm rather than the exception.
That's great. I was watching with incredible sadness. I don't know if others saw the destruction of the 20,000 dump bikes, which Uber missed such a huge opportunity to turn those into things that could actually be useful when we're seeing a bike boom. So just a lot of anger from our parts, and I know a number of other corners in social media.
And totally understandable. We actually had an opportunity to see an entire warehouse of those bikes. And we asked the question if they might be willing to donate some of those to allow us to kind of redistribute them. And we were told no, because they use a lot of proprietary equipment on that, and that it makes it very difficult for a traditional mechanic to actually be able to do any kind of real repair. And so many of those are in such a state of disrepair that they actually weren't comfortable with having them back out on the street. That said, I'm sure there are plenty that were in fine shape that would have served somebody for a period of time. So, it's definitely a loss to the community, but we definitely will keep working with the micromobility companies to see if there are options for a lot of those bikes or scooters or other devices.
When OFO pulled out of DC, they gave a bunch of their bikes to Gearing Up to, I guess, rehab and sell, or they sold off a bunch of their bikes in DC. So it is possible for the micro mobility companies to sell off their wares when they pull out. It's just a real travesty that that Jump was not able to do that. And Rudy, my partner in BikeMatch DC, is actually an alumni of Jump. So it's, an extra punch to the gut for us.
Yeah. So Kevin, you'd already started to lean into the question. We have, why don't we make this our last question? It comes in from Eli, and he said, can you talk about how to keep the momentum going on BikeMatch long-term as we move into recovery? So Ian, can we start with you? Obviously people are always going to need bikes, and we'll always have essential workers, and we're not sure when this is going to end. Can you talk a bit about how you see that role playing out for Specialized? And then Rachel, I'd love your perspective as well.
Yeah, I would say that's the conversation we're having right now is, how do we create something beyond just a moment in time? For us in the very near term, that means continuing the dialogue with our community, which, as I mentioned, is quite big and always growing. And so, just hearing this discussion on, there still being a gap. We know a lot of riders who have a lot of bikes, that require, that starts with us just sort of simply keeping the cadence of communication up on this topic, calling people's attention to, hey, there is a match program in your community. Here's an example of a bike that was matched. You can do it too. So we're starting with those kinds of initiatives. So direct communication to our email listservs, et cetera. But I think going forward, one of the things that we're kind of also really interested in starting to explore is, when somebody does decide it's time for a new bike, oftentimes there was an old bike. How are we starting to think about that transition and that flip and where that bike goes, because we already know there is this huge secondhand market for bikes. But is there a way that we can help to facilitate a donation to a matching program through, that communication that we're having as a brand? So those are conversations that we're engaging in right now, and don't plan on stopping.
Rachel, what does the future of BikeMatch look like in DC?
So I think here in DC proper, I think we'll continue going with some momentum, especially as people get back on bikes and, like Ian said, look for new bikes, and then maybe they want a new home for their old bike, as long as essential workers continue to be on the front lines without access to public transportation. I think we have a better opportunity to grow if we have more infrastructure to support bicycling. So hopefully the grassroots advocacy efforts will become fruitful on that front. But the other thing I think that we're going to another space that we're going to end up growing in as time goes on is going to be in the local jurisdictions in Montgomery County or in Arlington, Alexandria, inside the Beltway. And looking to those folks for bikes, but also we're getting more requests from the farther out areas to be able to match people with bikes, because as soon as the lights are all back on, whenever that might be, it's going to be complete gridlock again. And I don't think people are going to want to sit in their cars, so they're going to start looking to biking, and I don't think people are going to be ready necessarily to take public transportation. So what are our options? Bikes and e-bikes.
Well, that's a very hopeful ending. So maybe let me just end by thanking all of you, Rachel, Kevin, and Ian, for really being on the front lines of helping to advance this bike boom. And I know none of you are new to this, but you've clearly all stepped up in really creative ways to help bring really significant needs to communities all across the city that you're in and across the country, to provide this essential tool. I just want to end with a plug, which is for everybody who's on this call, I would encourage you, if you're not already, to get to know and potentially join your local bike organization, whether it's in DC, in LA, New York, or whatever community you're in. I think all of us are stronger when we stand together. And I think the incredible thing about biking, as I'm experiencing also for my 4-year-old who's learning how to ride for the first time, is that freedom that you do experience when you get on a bike and you can see the world. The problem, the unfortunate problem is that our cities take that freedom away from kids and really make safe biking unsafe in so many of our communities. So, we want to ensure that as many people can ride as possible, and we can ensure that everybody who does ride is entitled to a safe, equitable, dignified way of getting around, and that's simply just by building a protected and connected bike network. So again, we all stand stronger together, and we're so grateful for all of your time. And again, Ian, Rachel, and Kevin, thank you again for making the time. And for everybody, I know we spend most of our days now in front of Zoom screens, but hopefully this was slightly different, a little bit more enjoyable, and you felt closer to your community of bike enthusiasts and people doing bike match around the country. So with that, I thank you all. I wish you a good rest of the day, and hope to stay connected with you. Be well.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you again.